Okay, so today we're going to be starting Unit 1.1, which is the Introduction to Cells. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the cell theory. And what that basically says is that all organisms, anything that's considered living, is made of at least one or more cells, and that the cell is the smallest unit of life, that nothing else smaller can survive, and that every cell arrives from a pre-existing cell, and we know that spontaneous generation has been disproven, so life doesn't just usually come out of nowhere. So all cells have certain characteristics, no matter what kind they are. Every cell is going to have a membrane. It's going to contain some kind of genetic material that directs all of its cellular activity, and it's going to contain some sort of chemical reactions that are usually catalyzed by enzymes inside that cell. And every cell needs to have some way to generate energy. And remember, we have our autotrophs that do that via photosynthesis, and our heterotrophs who have to go out and capture other animals in order to gain energy. And the last thing is that all cells are limited in size. So just a quick note about the whole size thing. We're going to look at the ratio of surface area to volume. So skip that one. So a cell's volume, and that's just like how much is contained in it. If we think of it as like a box, like how much volume is in that box. The cell volume is going to determine how many chemical reactions can happen. And those chemical reactions require the import of reactants and the export of any waste. So any larger volume that you have is going to need more reactants because it's going to be doing more chemical reactions inside that cell. Now, the surface area, which is just like going to be the outside covering, is what is determining the rate of that entry and exit. So as the volume increases, the surface area isn't going to be able to keep up enough to help import enough reactants. So the cells would not be able to import enough reactants in order to do the chemical reactions that they're going to do. So this is just sort of a visual graphic of that. If I have a cell, and let's pretend that these are like cubes, and let's say that one side of it is 1 micrometer on each side, you can see that the volume is increasing pretty drastically with even just an additional micrometer added to each side. And I'm not going to make you do the math on this right now because you get to do this on your homework. But know that as we increase the surface area, and that's just the total area of all the different sides of the cube, the volume is going to increase much faster. So the ratio of surface area to volume is going to go down really quickly. And so if we graph this, and you'll do this yourself in your homework, I don't want to spend too much time on it, is that as volume increases, the surface area is not able to keep up. So large cells are basically not sustainable. There's a limit to how big they can get. So that's how cells normally work, but I just told you those rules because there are some that are going to break them. There are a couple of exceptions. So I said at the top that all cells have membranes. So some things like the muscle in your body, the striated muscle, are formed by smaller cells fusing together. So instead of having one nuclei in a cell, it's got many, even hundreds. And the cells, even though I just told you a second ago that most of them they have a limit on how big they are, these cells are quite large. And so the other example that you have to know is the aseptic fungi. So some of these fungi have hyphae, which I believe they stretch out to sort of find nutrients. And just like the striated muscles, these are not separated cells. They have multiple nuclei in them, and so they basically make one big compartment. So they break that rule of all cells have membranes. The other one is the giant alga. So this is a single cell with a single nuclei, but it can be up to 100 millimeters long, which is pretty big for a cell. And at the top, I said that all cells contain genetic material, which is true most times except for like red blood cells. They don't have any nucleus and they don't have any DNA, and they cannot replicate by themselves. So just a review. So cell theory is all organisms are made of one or more cells. The cell is the smallest unit of life. all cells arise from pre-existing cells and spontaneous generation does not occur. So that just means like life doesn't appear out of nowhere. The characteristics of life is that most of these cells have some sort of membrane. Most of them contain genetic materials. We're going to pretend that all cells have chemical reactions catalyzed by enzymes inside of them, that all cells have to have some way to generate energy, and that there is some limit on the cell size, which is always true except when it isn't, like in the case of striated muscle that have multiple nuclei in really large cells. Same with the aseptic fungi. So both of these guys break the rule that all cells have membranes and one nuclei each. So this is the rule that's broken with both of these guys, and they are larger than normal cells. And so the giant algae, they break the rule in that they are also extremely large cells, and the red blood cells break the rule in that they do not contain any genetic material. Okay. So, moving on to the functions of life, there are a lot of different characteristics of living things, and there's 7 that I'm going to want you guys to know just off the top of your head. And if you can, use this mnemonic or whichever one that you come up with. The one that I have is Mrs. Heng. So there's something with an M, R, S, H, E, N, G, and we'll go through each of these in terms. So the first thing that all living things do is metabolism. So all metabolism is reactions that either break down or build up molecules. So photosynthesis and respiration would be an example of this. So photosynthesis builds glucose molecules and respiration breaks down those molecules for energy. So that would be the M for metabolism. The R is reproduce. So all cells, except for those exceptions, are all living things, I should say, are able to reproduce. So everything is considered, a thing is considered living if it can produce offspring, if it can pass on those genes. So like this horse, we know it's alive because it can make a baby horse. So the next one is S for sensitivity, and that's the ability to change and respond to your environment. So these plants are aware of where the sun is and they can change. They can decide to grow towards the light. So they're able to respond to the environment. So metabolism, just the misses, have chemical reactions that can break down or build molecules. All living things can reproduce, so produce offspring and pass on their genes, and they are sensitive to changes in the environment. They are able to respond to it. So if you saw a lion in the room, you would be able to respond to that stimuli and run away. So that's the MRS of the functions of life. So the H is homeostasis. So I know that's a weird word, and basically all it means is keeping conditions the same. So right now you have homeostasis of water in your body. If you drink too much water, you'd have to pee. So it's keeping the water, levels in your body the same. If you got too warm, you would probably sweat, and then you'd want to do what? You'd want to drink more to like rebalance the water in your body. Same thing with homeostasis, right? So what temperature are humans generally? So we're around 98 degrees, and our body works really hard to stay at 98 degrees. When you get too cold, your muscles are going to shiver to warm you up. When you get too hot, you sweat, and that's going to cool you down. So homeostasis just means keeping internal conditions the same within a set limit. So temperature and like water are an example of those. So now on to the E, and that's excretion. You might have heard it as egestion, and that's just the removal of waste products. So for us, it's pooping and peeing. For any single-celled organisms, they probably just diffuse their waste products out of their membrane. And then the next one is N, nutrition. So all living things need to obtain food somehow to provide energy for metabolism and for growth. And so that last one is growth. So the last G is growth, so gradual increase in size. So you started life as a small little baby, and over time you have gotten to be the size that you are now. So this is a yeast cell, and they divide asexually. And so this is the mom cell, and this is the new baby cell, and over time it's going to get big like these guys over here. So all living things will grow. Okay, so just to recap the functions of life, remember Mrs. Hang, not Hanger. So the M is for metabolism. So remember, that's any chemical reaction that's building or breaking down molecules inside the cell. The R is reproduction, where you're producing offspring and you are passing on your genes. The S is sensitivity and response to the environment. So you're running away when you see a lion, or you're moving towards food if you're a paramecia. The H is homeostasis, so that's just maintaining balance in either, like, say, your temperature, where you shiver to warm up, or you sweat to cool down, or you drink water to because you're dehydrated. So that's homeostasis, is keeping balance of different things. The E is for excretion, so that's for the removal of waste products. And N is for nutrition, so all living things need to find some kind of food and energy to power their different processes, and all living things will grow over time. So in order to be considered alive, an organism has to possess all of these characteristics to fit that definition. So we're going to talk about two unicellular examples of that, and the first one is our old friend, the paramecia. So the first thing I want to point out is these little hair-like structures here. So these allow the paramecia to move, and so the paramecia are actually heterotrophs, so they have to go chase down other organisms to eat them. And so this is a form of being sensitive to the environment. They're responding to their environment by chasing food. And then this is what this actually looks like. So the hair is beating and it's helping the paramecia move along and capture some food. So, like all living things, the paramecia has a membrane which is going to control what enters and exits this cell, because we do have to maintain that internal cellular environment. And then this cytoplasm is where all of the metabolic reactions are occurring. So I'm just pointing out these different functions of life as we go along. So membrane entering and exit, that's part of homeostasis. And then the cytoplasm is where the metabolic reactions are happening. We have this nucleus, which directs all cellular activity, and for whatever reason, IB is putting this under reproduction because it does have to divide to reproduce. These guys just asexually reproduce, so we'll go ahead and file that under reproduction. Paramecia always also have these contractile water vacuoles. So what they do is they are responsible for maintaining a certain water level inside the paramecium. These are an aquatic organism, so water is constantly diffusing into the organism, and in order to keep that level the same so they don't like pop in the water, they have these contractile vacuoles that are going to push it back out. And so you can see there's two of them, one on either end. When they sort of squish out all their water, they make these sort of star-shaped patterns that we're seeing here. And you'll notice this sort of like running stuff coming this way. And that is the anal pore for the paramecia. So that's how it gets rid of its waste products. And so this is just sort of a better look at this. So the anal pore has the excretion, is doing the job for excretion here. And then paramecia, this is a heterotroph, and once it eats something, it stores that extra in a food vacuole. So it's just sort of, I guess it keeps it around for like a snack. And this falls under the category of nutrition. So the paramecia is doing all 7 characteristics that we would consider to make it alive. So it's responding to its environment, or if we just go from the top. So the M for metabolic reactions, it's doing those in the cytoplasm. The R would be to reproduce, which it can. Asexually, it can just divide. The S for sensitivity to the environment, so the cilia allows it to move towards the food. And then let's see, we had H, homeostasis. So that is like these contractile vacuoles who are contracting to push out water, so there's not too much water in the organism. The membrane also participates in membrane homeostasis by regulating what's coming in or out of the cell. So that's our H. The E for energy, we're going to put that, probably also somewhere in the cytoplasm, because that's where respiration is probably taking place. The N, nutrition, we'll put that with the food vacuole because that's where it stores its food, and the growth is just always happening. So over time, they're going to get bigger. So the So that's a heterotrophic example. So this has a little green color, so you can guess accurately that it is an autotroph that is doing photosynthesis. And you can see that this one moves a little bit differently. It has this weird name like chlamydia. I can't really pronounce it off the top of my head. So this guy has these two whip-like, appendages here, and these have a special name, and that's how they're moving, is flagella, right? So these guys operate in a really similar way to the paramecia. So they too do their metabolism inside of the cytoplasm. They also have contractile vacuoles that's monitoring the homeostasis of water, just like the paramecia, because they also live in water. They also have this membrane that's creating that barrier that controls what enters and leaves, which falls under the category of homeostasis. But what's a little bit different about these guys is that they don't have a special anal pore to get rid of their waste. They excrete just directly by diffusion. So waste products just diffuse out through the cell. They just sort of float out. But they do have that different movement. So this flagella allows them sensitivity to the environment. What it's actually doing is it's trying to swim toward the light. So it's responding to its environment. It does have this nucleus which either divides asexually to reproduce and pass down its genes, or they can fuse together to do sexual reproduction. So they have that option there. They also have these eye spots at the front, which were a little hard to see in the GIF, but again, this allows them to detect sunlight because they are photosynthetic and they want to respond to their environment. They can move towards the light using that eye spot. And their nutrition, in contrast to the paramecia, comes from photosynthesis because they are autotrophs, they're producers. Okay, so that's it for our unicellular animals, and now we're going to move on to talk about animals or organisms with multiple cells. So this is an early stage embryo, and you a long time ago started off life just like this embryo right here. You started as one cell, and then over time that one cell divided into two, and then it divided into four, and those 4 divided into 8, those 8 into 16, and so on. And you underwent a process exactly like this, which is called development. So this embryo is now forming a blastula stage. That's what it's called when it has all the cells at the top, and they're going to go all over the embryo in a gastrulation, and then they're going to start to form something that looks a little bit like a sea monkey. And this is something like what you look like too. So if I pause here, you can start to see something that looks like muscle forming, sort of a backbone forming, and you can start to see something that looks like a face, albeit a sea monkey face, but there it is. So we see now an eye. Ooh, hey, go back. Don't do that. So now we see the eye. And obviously this little critter is starting to get some motion, and over time it gets even more active. If we let it go a little further on, it's going to start to get some melanocytes. It's going to start to get some color. And let's see, let's back up right there for a second. Did you see the little baby heartbeat right there? One more time. Right there. So it's got a little heartbeat going. It's obviously got a little circulatory system. It has a brain that you can see really well right there. So from one cell, you got many different kinds, and at the end you get this little fishy. But you went through a process exactly like this before you were born, and so this is just another cool look at a fishy, and this is at the back. And what sort of cells do you think these are? So if you guessed neurons, you're correct. They are moving, I believe these are motor neurons that are moving down away from the spinal cord and going into the different parts of the fish body. So this is pretty cool. So how do we get all of these different types of cells from one? So we start with what we're going to call a stem cell. So a stem cell is kind of a little generic. It doesn't have like a job except to divide and become everything else. So a stem cell can go off and become a neuron, which has a really different job and function than, say, an epithelial cheek. So at the beginning of the year, we did this lab where you guys, scrubbed inside your cheeks and you looked at your own cells. But this cell looks really different than a neuron, right? So this one doesn't have this elongated appearance. It doesn't have all of these little branches, I think these are called dendrites, reaching out, because these guys are, their job is to make connections and to send signals to one another, versus your cheek cells is just there to sort of protect your mouth. And we compare that to, say, like muscle cells, which you probably already picked up. These look really different than like your cheek cells, right? They have these like really big lines in them. They have a different color. They're red, whereas your cheek cells are pretty clear. And then we have like your red blood cells, which have like these sort of circular and flat appearances. And so what we know is that each cell type has a really different shape. The red blood cells look really different than your muscle cells, look really different than your cheek cells, look really different than your neurons, and are really different than, say, like your bone cells. And each one has a different function. And the process that gets you there is something called differentiation. So you start with a stem cell, and when it differentiates, it grows into these final highly specialized forms that make up your multicellular organism. So in every cell, all of the genes are always present. Remember, you have your nucleus in your eukaryotes, and they carry the entire genome for that organism. So inside that genome, I have genes for my neurons and genes for my muscle and genes for my red blood cells. But in the stem cell, none of these are expressed yet. So a gene might be present, but its product is not always expressed. So when this stem cell starts to divide and go off on its different path, the genes for the muscle and the red blood cells are still in the cell, but maybe only the genes for neurons are expressed. And then that's why that cell becomes a neuron. So similarly, in a different, progeny of this one stem cell, it still has the genes for the neurons and the red blood cells, but only the genes for the muscle are expressed. So then that cell knows to become a muscle. And then the same thing happens for the red blood cells. It still has the entire genome. These genes didn't go away, but only the genes for the red blood cells are expressed, which gives you your red blood cells. So there is this idea of emergent properties. And all an emergent property is it's a property that only comes from an interaction of the different cells, that it's not present in the single cells. So on your notes, I want you to write that like cells get together to form tissues, which form organs, which form organ systems, which form an organism. So the cells individually are not going to display the same characteristics as the entire organism. So if I look at, like, say, a neuron by itself or with only a few other neurons can form connections and fire, but that neuron is not going to have emotions or consciousness or thought. That consciousness and thought is an emergent property that is only present in the fully formed organism. So emergent properties aren't in the cells alone, they are only in the fully formed organism. So the other thing that could be an emergent property is like breathing, right, in humans, right? So we have our lung cells that get together with muscles, which make breathing happen. So a cell by itself doesn't really breathe. It might do respiration, but that's not the same as breathing. So same thing with like a heartbeat and circulation. So if I put cardiac cells by themselves, maybe they'll contract, but they're not going to circulate anything because they're not connected to a circulatory system. Or something like running. So if I put your muscle cells in a petri dish, they're not going to grow legs and run. They can contract, but that's pretty much it. Similarly, an immune response, if I put any of your immune cells in a petri dish by themselves, they couldn't really kill anything. It takes the entire system to do that. So an emergent system is something that only occurs in the fully formed organism, not with the cells by itself. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what stem cells are. We know that all cells from when we're developing come from these stem cells. But these are specialized cells that have the ability to divide and differentiate into many cell types. So like I said, you started off life as one cell, and then you were able to divide and develop all your different cell types that you are as a fully formed human today. So there are different categories of embryonic stem cells, or of stem cells in general. So one of them is the embryonic stem cell. And these are going to come from the embryos, sort of like what I just showed you. So these come from early stage embryos, and they want them this early because they have not really differentiated yet. And because they have not differentiated, this is so differentiation is sort of like a one-way path. Once you start going down a path, you cannot go backwards for the most part. So these guys are very valuable because there's something called totipotent. And totipotent means that you can become any cell type. So if I get a hold of one of these, I can coax it into becoming a neuron and use it maybe to help treat an Alzheimer's or paralysis patient. I can turn it into maybe cardiac muscle and help a person who's had a heart attack heal. Maybe I can give it to somebody and help heal their brain after they had a stroke. I can make it into anything. So that's why people, are really wanting to use them. The problem is that they come from embryos. And to extract these cells, you basically kill the embryo. A lot of people feel like that's taking a life. The other disadvantage is that you're looking at a donor tissue. And any donor tissue, just like in kidney or lung donations, you run the risk of eventual rejection. The other probably worst thing about embryonic stem cells is they form tumors extremely easily, and some really weird ones too that we'll talk about later. And the other thing is that it's hard to control that differentiation. There's still a lot of work being done on exactly, how do you get a specific kind of neuron? What signals does it take to get like bone? So that's all still a new science. So the other kind of stem cells are the umbilical cord stem cells. So these are, after a baby is born, they go into the umbilical cord and then they remove some of the stem cells. The advantage is that it's less ethically challenging. The baby isn't hurt by doing this. And the advantage for the child is that their idea is that they're going to take these blood stem cord cells, store them for the use of this child later. So you don't run the risk of tissue rejection later in life. The disadvantage of these guys is that instead of being totipotent, they are something called multipotent, meaning they can make a lot of cell types, but only the ones that are from blood cell lineages. So they can make blood cells or they can make immune systems. But if this baby had some sort of like stroke later and needed neurons, those cells aren't going to do that. The other thing is that any congenital defect is still going to be present. So say this baby has sickle cell anemia, well, those cord cells are going to have sickle cell anemia too, so it doesn't really do you any good to have them. You'll just make more bad cells. So that's the story on umbilical cord cells. The last one is the adult stem cells. So this is where they take tissue directly from an adult. They send it through some magic potion that basically turns it into an induced stem cell. So the advantages of this is that it's really less ethically challenging. You're taking it directly from the donor who's going to use it, so there's basically no chance of tissue rejection. The disadvantage, again, is that it's only multipotent. You can't make everything. And again, any congenital genetic defect is still going to be present. And then the other thing is they're kind of hard to retrieve. So for example, if you wanted a blood stem cell, you'd have to basically crack open your bone and get at the bone marrow. So that's the disadvantage. The other thing is, and I said this earlier, is it's hard to make stem cells behave how you want them to or how you expect them to. So this woman had a stem cell treatment and she was trying to fix her paralysis. And what they did is they took cells from her nose, basically, and they tried to make neurons to cure her paralysis, and instead what she got was a nose on her spine, and that it actually did produce mucus and all that stuff. So this is still a pretty new area of science, and it can go wrong really easily. So yeah. Um, okay, so how would we potentially use this? So one thing that you can use is to treat paralysis, but I really want you to know specifically these two. So one of them is Stargardt's disease, and so what this is it's an inherited condition that basically degenerates the macula in the retina. So this is a healthy retina. This is a healthy macula. And then in this one, you can see that this area is starting to degenerate. So these people who have this will go blind eventually, which is pretty hard. So in 2010, they approved the use of stem cells to treat this. And so these are coming from embryos. So embryonic stem cells are grown up from a donor and then put into the children to help cure this condition. So their estimate is that um, if it works, it'll help about 200 million people, but I don't think that it has yet. This is one of the promises that hasn't really come to fruition, so the current status is they're still working on it. This one is active. So leukemia, right? So leukemia is a form of cancer where the white blood cells divide out of control. So if this was like a normal blood smear, yeah, I'd expect to see like a couple of white blood cells in a normal person's blood. But when people have leukemia, these guys divide out of control. And when that happens, you have to get rid of them because a cancer will kill a person who has it. So, what they do, and this one tends to be a childhood disease, which makes it extra sad, is they'll use chemotherapy to basically kill all the cells in the bone marrow. So, either chemotherapy and radiation together, so they basically kill off all of the bone marrow. And then what they'll do is they'll take donated stem cells from somewhere else because, again, if this is in a child, they probably had a genetic defect that made them more likely to get cancer. So they take donated stem cells, they grow them in culture, and then they put them back into the bone marrow and let that repopulate. And this actually does work pretty well. Okay, so for the magnification stuff, I'm going to leave this for tomorrow. We'll come back to that. All right.